I want to invite you to take your Bibles, open me to Proverbs chapter 7. Proverbs 7. We're going to look at the whole chapter this morning. As you turn there in your Bible, you turn on your device, you make your way there. I just want to give a word of thanks, and I don't know who to thank, so I'm just going to say it out loud here generally, and it'll land on whoever it should land on. But last week in the message, I talked about discontent, and tried to just use a humorous story there about the fact that I have 3 swords hanging on my wall, but the one thing that I was missing in order to really be content and find peace in my life and meaning and purpose and satisfaction was an axe. I didn't have an axe. I was a man without an axe, and it really just joking and so forth. But Friday, I came home from church, and there was a box on my porch, and what do you think was in that box? I just gave it away. There was an awesome axe in that box from Amazon. I don't know who gave it to me, so I'm just going to say thank you. I don't know what lesson the Lord wants me to learn from that. I mean, I've never had a cruise either, but no, that's a joke. That's a joke. But I was content before the axe, but it's super cool, and I really appreciate it. And a sentence I never thought I would ever say in church, but somebody blessed me with an axe, so there you go. Moving on. This morning, we've turned a corner, right, in our summer series that we've entitled The Gospel Overcoming. The first 5 weeks, we were thematically tied together in this idea of the gospel overcoming, but each message was its own standalone topic. Last week served as the hinge as we talked about discontent, because all those things we looked at before, brokenness and trauma and regret and chronic pain and grief, they can all produce in us this sense of dissatisfaction with where we are in our life. We don't like it, we don't want it, we want to be through with it, we want to be able to move on and go on to something different. And so we need to be on guard against discontent when we experience those kinds of circumstances. Likewise, if we don't deal with discontent in our life, it can be, I use this expression, it can be the leash that leads us into active addiction. And so we're going to spend the last 5 weeks, kids, think about that, only 5 more weeks left of summer, and then we'll be into September, and you'll be looking at school again in whatever form that's going to take. We're all waiting to find out. But the last 5 weeks, considering the single topic now of addiction. And the reason why, thinking about how I structured this summer series, the reason why I chose the topics that I did is because I think that for most people, when they think about topics such as trauma or chronic pain or addiction, for instance, their first thought is not, gee, I wonder what the Bible has to say about that. And what I'm hoping to do through this summer series is just convince you, if you need to be convinced, that God through His Word speaks into every human struggle, and that again, second thing I'm hoping to accomplish in your life is to again convince you, if you need to be, that the gospel is enough. Jesus is enough. Let me remind you of our premise statement. The gospel of Jesus Christ is the most transforming force for good in the universe. As such, it is the fundamental answer to humanity's fundamental problems, even the problems and issues of addiction. There is therefore no struggle it cannot overcome, no hurt it cannot heal, and no regret it cannot redeem. And that is certainly true for the struggles, the hurts, and the regrets that are bound up in addictive behaviors. Because listen, addiction is an inherently painful condition that, listen now, we slip into on a velvet slide. Now, if you hear me say that expression of we slip into on a velvet, that doesn't make any sense to you. I hope that it will by the time we work our way through Proverbs chapter 7. I want to give you 2 different definitions of addiction. I think the first one that I'm going to show you, I think it's good for what it is, but I also think it's a bit insufficient. So notice this comes from Webster's dictionary. And I think, again, it's good for what it is, but I think it's a bit insufficient. An addiction is a compulsive, chronic, physiological or psychological need for a habit-forming substance, behavior, or activity having harmful physical, psychological, or social effects, and typically causing well-defined symptoms upon withdrawal or abstinence. Again, I think that's good for what it is in terms of a description of what addiction looks like. I think it's insufficient to actually define what addiction is. The world is really good at observation, right? The observational sciences, the world is awesome at being able to see things. What sometimes they struggle with, especially what are considered the soft sciences like psychology and other things, is getting to the root cause of the issue. Part of the reason why they struggle to get to the actual root cause is they start with a wrong anthropology, right? They start with a wrong understanding of the nature of man and the nature of God and the nature of the world. And so they can observe many things very accurately, but come to the wrong conclusion that they seek to piece those things together. And looking at this, I see a very accurate description of what addiction looks like, but not such a good definition of what it actually is. I'm going to give you what I think is a better definition of addiction, and it's actually very simple. An addiction is the voluntary enslavement of the will. It's the voluntary enslavement of the will. So it's the turning of oneself over to the controlling influence of some substance, person, or behavior. It's what happens when a false functional savior becomes enthroned in the heart and becomes an individual's, highest affection. That thing that they love more than any other thing. It's the natural and predictable outcome of an unchecked sin and an unrestrained heart. Let me say that again. It's the natural and predictable outcome, meaning, you can chart the course, right? Addiction should not catch anyone by surprise if you can actually see the steps a person is taking, the decisions that they're making. It's the natural and predictable outcome of an unchecked sin at work in an unregulated heart, a heart that refuses to live within limits. A heart that refuses to push away from the table and say enough. A heart that is always discontent and never satisfied. Addiction is the predictable end of that journey. So listen, even though addiction can most certainly cause disease, and there are a great many things a person can be addicted to that can actually cause a physiological tissue change in the body, right, resulting in an actual disease, addiction itself is not a disease. Addiction is idolatry. Addiction is not fundamentally a medical issue. Addiction is fundamentally a worship issue. And again, I hope that becomes clear for us really over the next 5 weeks, and then what God would say about that in His Word and what we ought to be doing about that to guard our own hearts and lives and position ourselves to help other people who might be struggling. Let me give you some statistics to consider this morning. 21 million Americans, it's estimated, have an active substance abuse problem right now. So again, that may not be you, but I certainly am in no position to just assume that it's not you, because I don't know what happens in your home. I don't know what you do in secret. But it's probably fair to say that if it's not you, you know someone that is true of. Or you know a family who that is true of. So you're only 1 or 2 degrees separated from someone who's struggling with substance abuse. Now, when I say substance abuse, what we ought to be thinking, right, rightly, naturally thinking, is we're talking about alcohol, we're talking about things like marijuana, methamphetamines, crack cocaine, heroin, those kinds of things when we talk substance abuse. But that doesn't take into account other kinds of addiction, right? Things like an addiction to food, right? An addiction to pleasure that can lead one into an addiction to pornography or to immoral behaviors and sexual expressions and so forth. We're talking about things like video game addiction. If you were to go to China and you were to look at addiction statistics, one of the most rapidly growing forms of therapeutic residential treatment is video game addiction, which totally results from someone being dissatisfied with the life they have and seeking refuge in a virtual world where they're somebody and they can control things and they succeed and so on and so forth. And they give themselves over to that because they just don't like the life they're actually living in the real world. Even things like phone addiction. Again, it's estimated that the average American looks at their phone. I reach down because that's where my phone might be. The average American looks at their phone 150 times a day. That's every 6 minutes. What's going on? Anybody liking my Instagram? Anybody commenting? Anybody reaching out? Did I miss anything? What's happening in the world? Every 150 times a day connected to our phone. But listen, it doesn't even have to be those overt behaviors that a person can become addicted to. It can be things like someone can be addicted to being loved, being wanted, being accepted, being valued, being successful. Someone can be addicted to things like being honored, right? Being obeyed, being respected. All of those things can become addictions. All of those things can become idols in a person's heart that drive everything that they do. Again, there are some very predictable processes that are at work here, right? You think about what happens in a person's heart. You have perhaps even a very legitimate desire that is born in your heart, maybe even a desire for a good thing. But that desire is allowed to grow unchecked, and you let it become a need. I don't just want that, I need that. And then you allow that need to continue to grow in your heart unchecked, it will quickly grow to become a demand. It's not just that I want that, it's not just that I need that, it's that I have to have that. Now listen, by the time a desire becomes a need, you may or may not be addicted, but by the time that need becomes a demand, you most certainly are. And not only are you most certainly addicted, listen, you are most certainly dangerous. You're dangerous to the people around you. Sometimes physically, but always relationally, emotionally. Just take, for instance, right, one that we might not ordinarily think of, but think of the man who demands to be respected in his home. He will not tolerate disobedience from his children. That is a dangerous man. So there are processes at work that can take things that we might not ordinarily think of as being idols and make them that consuming, driving, first affection in our heart. As we walk through the series these next 5 weeks, substance abuse, though, may find its way more to the forefront of comments that will be made and so on and so forth. But I don't want you to divorce yourself from what we're talking about, because I would contend, as Calvin said, right, the heart is a factory of idols, right? It's constantly giving birth to things that compete for our affection to Christ. And so we all need to be thinking and considering and applying these things. But thinking about the substance abuse issue, consider these, again, statistics. About 25% of first-time heroin users will go on to become addicts. So that person who thinks I can handle it is gambling 1 in 4 that they're going to become a full-blown addict. And I had the privilege for a season to spend time on a regular basis down at the Renovation House in Spencer, which is a gospel-centered, Bible-centered rehabilitation program. It's a year-long program where the men and women live there, and they're just saturated in Bible and gospel and so on for that entire year. And talking to the guys that were in the program at that time, it became very clear that heroin was a different beast in how quickly it grabs hold of you and how it poisons you and how painful it is to get free of its grip. But all addictions at some level are painful. Parents, take note of this. More than 90% of all addicts began using before their 18th birthday. More than likely, right, living in their parents' home. And consider this one. In 2018, so just a couple of years ago, I would guess the number is actually higher now, 35% of 12th graders had tried marijuana. A third. 1 in 3 had tried marijuana by their senior year of high school. And I know that listening online, perhaps even in this room, there are some of you who have some experience with marijuana who are thinking, you're thinking to yourself, so what, right? Everybody tries marijuana. Well, in 1990, the amount of THC, which is the mind-altering component of marijuana, made up 4% of what was being consumed by the marijuana smoker, 4%. Now, the percentage of THC in marijuana is better than 12%. So listen, today's weed is not your grandmama's weed. Another sentence I never thought I'd say in church. It's a different thing. It's a different thing. Much more addictive, much higher consequence, much more damaging. And here's the reality. We're not very far away living here in New York from legalized recreational marijuana. And there's this sort of casual approach to it like it's not a big deal. And I'm just here to say to you, it's a big deal. And it sets the person on that velvet slide that takes them to a banquet in the grave. So this morning, I have really just one ambition, one desire, one point I want to try to make, and that is to try to show you through Proverbs chapter 7 how sin seeks to deceive us. I would use words like woo us. In fact, I really prefer the word seduce us, how sin seeks to seduce us into voluntarily surrendering our will to the enslavement of a behavior, to a person, to a substance, the giving over of ourselves to something else, how it sings to us, talks to us, again, deceives us, woos us, seduces us into voluntary slavery. And I think Proverbs 7 is one of the best pictures in Scripture of what it looks like to ride that velvet slide right into, again, a banquet in the grave. So I hope you're there. Proverbs 7. We're going to look at it in 3 chunks. The first one is verses 1 through 5. Notice what Solomon, the author here, is writing to his son and sons. My son, keep my words and treasure up my commandments with you. Keep my commandments and live. Keep my teachings as the apple of your eye. Bind them on your fingers. Write them on the tablet of your heart. Say to wisdom, you are my sister, and call insight your intimate friend, to keep you from the forbidden woman, from the adulteress with her smooth words. I would contend that for the vast majority of us in this room, again, assuming that there is not a widespread substance abuse problem ongoing within the church family right now, that these first 5 verses are the most important for us. Because what Solomon is saying in these first 5 verses is he is encouraging his son to build his life on a foundation of wisdom, on a foundation of truth, on a foundation of well-defined, established, authoritative convictions. You know what a conviction is, don't you? A conviction is a decision you make ahead of time. A conviction is a decision you make ahead of time so that when you find yourself being, under tension between giving into temptation and choosing sin on this side and giving into righteousness and glorifying God on this side, you don't have to decide in that moment what you're going to do because you've already decided what you're going to do before you got in that position of tension. Because, listen, here's the reality. I used to say this to the teens when I was youth pastor all the time. If you wait to decide what you're going to do until you're in that place of tension between sin and righteousness, that's a very hard spot to make a right choice. I have our teenage girls and teenage boys, and they begin to enter into dating relationships, and I would try to push so much to have well-defined boundaries set up around that relationship, because if you wait to decide what you're going to do after you've already taken a few roads down the path of intimacy together, and then you're going to decide to pull back from that and say no to that, you're positioning yourself for failure. That's a really hard place to make a good decision. But a conviction is a decision you've already made before you ever even get to that place, so that if you ever find your, God forbid, in that place, you don't need to decide what you're going to do. You've already decided what you're going to do. And Solomon is trying to encourage his son to build his life on a set of very well-defined convictions that will keep him from trouble. So, notice what he's going to try to do then in verses 6 through 20 is he's going to attempt, like any good father would attempt, to teach his son a very painful lesson, but to teach it to him through the example of someone else's mistakes. That's part of the essence of wisdom, isn't it, loved ones? That you don't have to walk into every dead end yourself in order to learn. The true is right, but you actually can learn from other people's mistakes, and that's what he's trying to do here in these verses in the middle here, verses 6 through 20. Notice what he says. For at the window of my house I have looked out through my lattice, and I have seen among the simple, I have perceived among the youths, a young man lacking sense. Passing along the street near her corner, taking the road to her house in the twilight in the evening, at the time of night and darkness. And behold, the woman meets him, dressed as a prostitute, wily of heart. She is loud and wayward. Her feet do not stay at home. Now in the street, now in the market, and at every corner she lies in wait. She seizes him and kisses him, and with bold face she says to him, I had to offer sacrifices, and today I have paid my vows. So now I have come out to meet you, to seek you eagerly, and I have found you. I have spread my couch with coverings, colored linens from Egyptian linen. I have perfumed my bed with myrrh, aloes, and cinnamon. Come, let us take our fill of love till morning. Let us delight ourselves with love. For my husband is not at home. He is gone on a long journey. He took a bag of money with him. At full moon, he will come home. So Solomon here is introducing us to two people that we're going to follow through this narrative. The first is a simple young man. Now, when he uses this word simple, when the Hebrew uses this word simple, it doesn't mean stupid, and it doesn't mean wicked. It means naive. It means easily deceived. I want to make that distinction with us this morning because I think there's a danger on our part as Christ followers to take a holier-than-thou attitude towards people struggling with addiction, sort of look down our nose at them and say, what wicked, terrible people. Look at the mess they're making. They deserve everything they're getting. I don't want to know them. I don't want to minister to them. I don't want to interact with them because I don't want their mess getting on me. And what you need to understand is no one starts out to be an addict. Nobody. Nobody wakes up one morning and just says, you know what, I think today's a good day to throw my marriage away, to throw my children away, to throw my livelihood away, to lose everything that was once dear to me, to end up living under a bridge at the end of the line in terrible health with no friends, in constant danger, just jonesing for the next fix. I think that's what I want to do today. No one starts like that. No one starts with wicked intent. They begin simply. They begin naively. They begin by thinking, I can handle this. It'll be all right. It's just one time. Everybody else seems to be doing it. And it doesn't take very long for someone who starts down that path to begin to experience negative consequences. But that simplicity that you began in turns into, I know there's going to be consequences, but those consequences are tomorrow's problem. See, part and parcel of what it means to be addicted is you live very myopically, right? Very nearsightedly. Life is lived at the end of your nose. It's all about right now. And yes, I know there's going to be a price to pay, but that's tomorrow. And then that eventually becomes, I don't even care about the price anymore. I don't care about the consequences. I just have to have what I have to have right now. Nobody begins wickedly, even if the addiction pushes them to do wicked things. It's not how they started. They started simply, naively, easy to be deceived and willing to be deceived. We're also introduced to this married woman, right? This adulterous woman. And as we read this text, I'm going to ask you to view this woman as a personification of sin. I think what Solomon is doing here is he's giving his sons, he's trying to teach his sons a painful lesson from someone else's mistakes through a conglomeration of observations that he has made as the wisest man who's ever lived. And he's just made this endeavor to study the human existence. That's partly what Proverbs is. It's partly what Ecclesiastes is. Solomon's desire to understand the human experience. But notice what he says about her, right? She's loud and wayward. Her feet don't stay at home, right? She's in the street. She's in the market. She's on the corner, right? It's this idea that there's danger everywhere. And so I'm going to encourage you to view her and what she says as a personification of sin, because again, as we become not just students of the gospel, but walking in wisdom, we also become students of sin. What she says is what sin says to all of us so often. So again, back into the text, verses 8 and 9, this is the young man. For at the window of my house I have looked out through my lattice, and I have seen among the simple, I have perceived among the youths a young man lacking sense. Now notice what this young man does. Passing along the street near her corner, taking the road to her house, in the twilight, in the evening, at the time of night and darkness. What I want you to notice on the part of the young man is intentionality. The young man may be naive, listen now, but he's not innocent. He's not innocent. He's making choices to position himself close to temptation and sin. We are definitely led to the impression that he knows the part of the town, the part of the city where this woman's going to be. So he takes the road to her house. And he doesn't go at the noon hour, right? He goes in the evening, in the time of night, in the time of darkness. This young man is making choices to position himself in a very dangerous place. Why? Because he lacks any sense of conviction. I'll illustrate it like this. I feel 100% confident being able to stand before you this morning and say to you, I will never again find myself in a 1 a.m. free-for-all bar fight. Never again. You say again, just let that go. How can you say, how can you be so confident? Because I've already made decisions to say, I'm just never going to be in a bar at 1 a.m. Right? It's just not going to happen. And listen, here's the benefit of having convictions. That one decision made a long time ago saves me from a ton of problems that I'll never have to face. That's the benefit of living with convictions that this young man has not yet learned. And so he's making active choices to position himself for danger. Proverbs will go on to say in chapter 22, the wise see danger and they turn back. The fool goes on and suffers for it. And we're also introduced to the woman, again, verses 10 to 12. And behold, the woman meets him, dressed as a prostitute, wily of heart. She's loud and wayward, her feet do not stay at home. Now in the street, now in the market, and every corner, she lies in wait. What I want you to notice here is there's intentionality on her part too. It's not just the young man who's choosing to go to a dangerous place. The woman is going out intentionally looking for him. Right, like a serial killer stalking their next victim. 1 Peter 5 says, what about the devil? And he's like a roaring lion. Doing what? Right? Prowling about, seeking those whom he may devour. Again, this woman, she's the personification of that, right? Not just content to stay at home. Sin is not content to wait for you to come to it. It will actively go out searching for you. It will actively go out trying to entice you. And that's what she's doing. I want you to notice, too, that there's absolutely no shame in her game whatsoever, right? I mean, she's just out there. She's brash. She's loud. And I would say that that's the world that we live in, right? We live in a day and age devoid of shame. Sin is celebrated. Sin is promoted. Sin is the fastest way to infamy in our culture. And for so many people today, right, Instagram and YouTube and Facebook, they'll take infamy over fame any day, right? And so let me do something sinful, let me do something wicked, let me do something stupid, let me do something, and then it'll go viral and I'll be rich and famous. Sin is normalized, right? Everything that culture used to consider sinful is now normalized and called good, and everything that used to be called good is now called evil. We are living in a very Corinthian environment. I'm so thankful that God gave us the books of 1st and 2nd Corinthians so that we could learn how to live in a Corinthian world that's given over to excess and pleasure. That's where we are. But listen, here again is why I don't want you to divorce yourself to all that we're talking about over these next 5 weeks just because you say you don't struggle with addiction. We are constantly under pressure to be reprogrammed by the culture that we live in. Constantly. Statistics will say, right, that the average Christian in America reads their Bible 1 day a week. 1 day a week. Statistics will say that the average committed Christian will attend their church 2 times a month. So 3 hours a month. Pastor Andy, one of the things that drives him as youth pastor is he knows that he gets 40 hours a week on average with a teenager. I said 40 hours a week. 40 hours a year. 40 hours a year to make an impact in a teenager's life. When the average teenager in America is on their phone 8 hours a day. Who's winning that battle for influence? Your 1 day a week that you crack your Bible? The hour and 15 minutes a week you spend at church? Or the culture that's seeking to reprogram your thinking through entertainment and commercial and advertising and so on for the average one of us watching television 4, 6, 8 hours every single day. Even as Christians, we are actively being reprogrammed of what is good and what is bad. Influence always tilts towards culture. So we live like this young man in a culture where we're constantly being tempted to sin. So again, there's something in here for every one of us. Notice in verses 13 through 20 the lies that this woman says to this simple young man. Beginning in verse 13. She seizes him, kisses him, and with bold face she says to him, I had to offer sacrifices, and today I have paid my vows. What is she saying here? She's saying, listen, I'm right with God. This is good. This is good. Sin is always trying to hide the reality of death until we don't care about death anymore. We looked at James in this series. We're going to look at James here in a few moments. But death always resides on the other side of a willful choice to choose of sin. And listen, in the beginning, sin dresses up for us. In the beginning, sin will put on some makeup. Right? In the beginning, sin will try to hide the reality of death that lies on the other side of that choice, because if we could see that temptation for actually what it was, an invitation to the grave, we'd all push away and say, no, I don't want that. But it comes to us wrapped up in a nice candy coating until it doesn't have to anymore. And for the addict sees sin much more clearly than the rest of us. They see the reality of death. They've experienced the reality of death associated with rebellion and sin against God. The problem is they've reached a point they don't care anymore. They don't care anymore. And so sin comes to this young man saying, I've paid my vows. I'm right with God. This is good. There's nothing holding us back. Put on her dress. Put on some makeup. It's good. And then notice what she says. So now I have come out to meet you, to seek you eagerly, and I have found you. I have spread my couch with coverings, colored linens from Egyptian linen. I have perfumed my bed with myrrh, aloe, and cinnamon. What is the lie here? She's saying, I've created the ideal environment for your maximum pleasure. Remember last week and the gospel overcoming discontent? This is sin coming to us and saying, listen, I'm the path to contentment. I'm the path to satisfaction. I'm the path to pleasure that you can't even imagine right now. And how many of us want that? How many of us, when we hear sin promise us that listen, this is the path toward what you want. This is the path towards everything that you've been looking for. Here's the problem with sin. In the beginning, it actually delivers, right? Sin promises maximum pleasure, and in the beginning, it delivers. Sin feels good. If it didn't, nobody would do it twice, right? The problem with it is it's subject to diminishing returns. And every time you give in to it, you get a little less back from it until it begins to take everything from you and give you nothing at all. Notice the last promise that sin makes that I would contend is the hardest to resist. Verse 19 and 20. Verse 18, come, let us take our fill of love till morning. Let us delight ourselves with love. Why? Because my husband is not at home. He's gone on a long journey. He took a bag of money with him. At full moon, he will come home. Literally, he's probably not coming back for a month. What is the promise that she's making that I would contend is so hard to resist? It's the promise of sin without accountability. Sin without consequence. That you can do this, and listen, you'll never get caught. No one will know. No one's going to get hurt. You can do this, and it's going to be okay. Listen, if you're not living your life with a set of well-defined convictions and you just think that you'll be able to handle it and you can make the decision to choose God and do the right thing in the moment when sin is singing to you and whispering to you that, listen, this is good, this is right, this is the pathway to your maximum pleasure. You've never experienced anything like what I'm offering you. And listen, you can have it all and there's no price to pay. And you're going to try in that moment to make a good decision? It just doesn't happen. It just doesn't happen. What's the problem with all these things that sin is saying? Well, they're all lies. What does God say to us in Galatians chapter 6, right? God will not be what? Mocked. You're not going to make a fool out of God, right? God will not be mocked. Whatsoever a man sows, that will he also reap. Every single time without exception. Right? He's woven that reality into the very fabric of the universe, right? Of the human experience. If you sow sin to your flesh, you're going to reap the consequences of death that come with that every single time without exception. So why do we give in to sin's lies so easily? Well, the answer is because sin is not the only one lying to us. We're lying to us too. It's not just that sin is seeking to deceive us. We actually want to be deceived. That's the sinfulness of sin. Notice what happens next, verse 21 to 27. With much seductive speech, she persuades him. With her smooth talk, she compels him. All at once he follows her, as an ox goes to the slaughter or as a stag is caught fast, till an arrow pierces its liver, as a bird rushes into a snare. He does not know that it will cost him his life. And now, O sons, listen to me and be attentive to the words of my mouth. Let not your heart turn aside to her ways. Do not stray into her paths. For many a victim she has laid low, and all her slain are a mighty throng. Her house is the way to Sheol. It's the way to the grave, going down to the chambers of death. See, at this point, in verse 21, this simple young man is fully and completely deceived. Notice that Solomon says all at once he follows her. I would suggest to you that it's not so much, the problem isn't so much that he makes a rash decision. Like he's not like in a moment just saying, making a quick rash decision. I think the problem is that he's making a late decision. No, with much seductive speech. When we read that much seductive speech, what you need to think is there's been time that's passed. Right? When she first approaches him, I've come out seeking you and I found you. He ought to have been like, get away from me, right? I'm not doing that, but he hung around. He starts to talk, and they get a little playful, and he entertains it, and he allows it to grow. And it isn't that all at once he follows her because he's making a rash decision. He's making a late decision when he should have got out of there and made a quick decision. He listened. He bought into the lies, began to believe them, and at this point, he is fully deceived. His heart has surrendered to her. And again, there is a predictable process at work here. I want to put three texts of Scripture. I want to put them side by side for us so we can see what this, again, very predictable process is at work in addiction. First one, again, we're going back to James 1. So important. James 1, 13 and 14. Let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted with evil, and he himself tempts no one. So what's going on, James? He tells us in verse 14, but each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed. Grab that word. Lured and enticed by his own desire. We talked about this last week, right? This idea of enticement, it's a fishing term. The hook has been baited. And listen, what did we say before? Even if it is Satan who's baiting the hook, the only reason that enticement has any appeal to your heart is because there's already a corresponding desire for it present in you. If that desire wasn't already there, there'd be nothing to stir up and draw out. But the hook gets baited. That desire gets stirred up. It gets drawn out. That desire that might have been laying dormant, now all of a sudden is presented with an opportunity to come to life. The first step in addiction is always enticement. It's always drawing out the desire that's already there. What's the next step? We are told in Hebrews chapter 12, verse 1, therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight, things that aren't necessarily sin, but they still slow us down, and the sin which clings so closely, which it's just like hangs on us, grabs us, entangles us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. And so this is the process, right, as we continue to follow sin down this path, that it's not just about enticing the desire, bringing it to life through an opportunity and an occasion to fulfill it and satisfy itself, but as we choose to go back to it again and again and again, right, the dangers of second sins, not just the thing you do once, but the thing you do twice becomes the thing you do 3 times, becomes the thing you do 4 times, is that sin begins to entangle itself around our heart, and it begins to choke out every other affection. Every other thing that you love and care about. That sin begins to consume it, begins to shut it out as it just tightens its grip around your heart until finally, where do we land? Jesus tells us in John 8:34. Jesus answered them, "Truly, truly, I say to you, everyone who practices," this is in a tense, voice, mood, and tense that suggests habitual lifestyle kind of activity, right? Whoever makes a habit of sin is what? Sin, slave. The Greek word used here for slave is doulos. The doulos of a house was the lowest slave in the household. It was the one who had no will of its own. That doulos existed only to do the will of its master. He had no individual identity whatsoever. That's the word Jesus is choosing here. The one who chooses to give himself over to sin becomes that slave, devoid of any independent will at all to that sin. He is now given over as an idolater and a worshiper, and all he lives for is the sin, the substance, the behavior, the person, the desire that has become a need, that has become a demand. And so the process happens the same way with every single person. It's enticement that leads to entanglement, that leads to enslavement. That's how sin works. And listen, in the beginning, sin is willing to serve you. That's how sin reinforces in our mind that we actually got it figured out. Because we don't experience all the negative consequences. Things actually go okay. We actually experience the pleasure of sin for that season. But listen, sin's agenda is never to serve you. It's always to ruin you. It will serve you in the beginning until it gets to the point where it no longer has to, and you serve it. That's addiction. If you follow sin far enough, pleasure always turns to pain. That's the nature of sin, to produce diminishing returns. But again, the addict gets to the point where the answer to every problem becomes more of what's just killing them. The heart is fully enslaved, a worshiper is born, and eventually the idol has total control, which was always the goal from the very beginning. Even when sin, in that very first moment, was seeking to entice that desire out of your heart and bring it to life, its desire, even in that initial moment, was never just to bring you pleasure. It was always to ruin and enslave you. Listen, can I say to you, loved one, that's why there's no such thing as a small sin. That's why there's no such thing as an inconsequential sin, because it starts you on a path to your complete ruin. I want to share with you a quote from Augustine. Augustine lived, about the year 400 AD, so this quote is 1,600 years old. I think it's just fantastic, but it's a little hard to understand just because of the language differences in using it. So I'm going to read the quote, and then I'm going to read for you my paraphrase of Augustine's quote. "Bound as I was, not with another man's irons, but by my own will. My will the enemy held, and thence had made a chain for me and bound me, for of a froward will was lust made. A lust served became custom, and custom not registered became necessity, by which links as it were joined together, whence I called it a chain, a hard bondage," he says, "held me enthralled." Let me read for you my paraphrase. Augustine would be saying to us, "I enslaved myself by 1,000 acts of my own will, as each new sin created a new link in the chain that I carried about around my neck. From a desire to do and to have what I wanted when I wanted it, a lust was made, and a lust made became a lust served, and a lust served became a habit, and a habit not checked became a need. Thus my bondage held me in its sorry grip. I put myself in bondage, and in bondage I willfully remained, and couldn't imagine life apart from my chains." That's the experience of every addict. The substance, the addiction, the idol becomes the answer to every problem, because the substance, the action, the behavior, the person becomes their highest affection. They can't envision life without it. How can I possibly go on without it? Life cannot be normal without it. I can't function without it. I wrestled with alcohol before I came to know Jesus Christ, and there were certain things that I was convinced of I couldn't do if I didn't have a drink. That's the danger of second sins. That's the danger of giving into cravings, thinking if you just did it one more, that would be enough. It's never enough. They create patterns that create habits that eventually put the heart on cruise control, and sin becomes our go-to move, and the addict cannot envision life apart from the substance. The idolater cannot envision life apart from the idol. Listen, that's why the path to freedom for the addict is so difficult and can take so long and be filled with so many ups and downs. And if you've been through addiction, if you're seeking to minister someone battling with addiction, you know that you've got to be in it for the long haul. That's why the renovation program is a year long. There's going to be steps forward and there's going to be steps back. There's going to be steps where you think, man, this person is doing awesome. And it could be 30 days, it could be 60 days, it could be 90 days. You think, man, we really turned a corner. And then all of a sudden your heart breaks because they've gone back to that old idol. They've returned back to that broken well, seeking something that isn't there for them. And you're like, oh, what happened? The challenge of addiction is that you're not just dealing with behaviors, you're dealing with affections. They love that. And you're trying to break that. You're trying to get them to love something else, something better, something more satisfying. And listen, what is that one thing that God has given us that we are to love more than anything else, that can finally and fully and truly and only satisfy the deep longings of the heart? It's Jesus Christ and Christ alone. So listen, we'll get into specific things about what you can do and not do to help people and to prevent relapse. And then the last message we'll do in this series is, how do you love an addict? If you happen to be living with someone or love someone who's dealing with addiction, how do you love them in a helpful way without empowering what they're doing? But listen, first and foremost, the number one thing that you can do is you got to lead them to Christ. You have to lead them to the cross. You have to help them see Jesus living, dying, rising, ascending, glorified with a promise of his soon return. They have to see him because he and he alone really loves them and is that superior satisfaction to anything the world has to offer. So we want to do that. I'm going to invite the worship team to come, and they're going to make their way back on stage. We're going to stand and we're going to sing, and we're going to prepare our hearts for communion. And we are going to look into, through the celebration of communion, the life, the death, the resurrection, the ascension, glorification, and promised soon return of the Lord Jesus Christ. And my prayer for all of us is that as we see Jesus, that it might break those false affections and might fully set all of our hearts on Christ and Christ alone.